My mother cleaned other people's houses for 31 years. She took the bus every morning at 6:15, winter included, and if you've ever stood at a bus stop in Hamilton in January, you know what that means. She wore the same 2 pairs of rubber-soled shoes on rotation, switching them out when the soles got thin enough to feel the sidewalk through them. She never complained about it. Not once, not to me, not to anyone. That was just the work, she said. That was just what needed doing. Her name is Lucille. She is 74 years old now, and her hands tell the whole story. Years of bleach and floor polish left them dry and cracked along the knuckles, even in summer. When she'd reach across the table to pass me something, I used to look at those hands and feel something I couldn't name when I was young. Now I know exactly what it was. It was shame, but not shame of her. It was shame that the world made her work that hard and still looked down at her for it. I'm 63. I drove a delivery truck for Canada Post for 26 years, then drove for a private logistics company after that. I bought a small house in Dundas when I was 31. Nothing impressive. A century home that needed more work than it was worth, but I loved it. It was mine. I raised my daughter there on my own after her mother and I separated. It wasn't always easy, but we managed. My daughter grew up knowing that you show up, you work, and you don't put on airs about what you think you deserve. She knew all of that. She just forgot it for a while. My daughter, she's 34 now, met her husband at a work conference in Toronto about 5 years back. He's from a different world than ours. His family has money the way some families have furniture, inherited, taken for granted, arranged to impress. His father's a finance. His mother sits on 2 boards and speaks at luncheons. They live in a house in Oakville that has a name, not a street address, a name. I don't mean to be uncharitable. They were always polite to me. That particular, careful kind of polite that keeps a wall up while smiling over it. I noticed from the beginning that my daughter changed a little around them. Laughed differently, spoke more carefully, ordered things at restaurants she would never have touched growing up. I didn't say anything because I thought it was normal. You adjust, you adapt, you want to fit in. I understood that. What I didn't understand, not until last spring, was that the adjusting had started to include adjusting away from us, from me. From her grandmother. It was my mother who first noticed it, actually. She called me one evening in March. She still calls, she refuses to text, says she can't trust her thumbs, and she said, very carefully, in the way she says things she doesn't want to hurt me with, that she felt like she'd been misplaced. That was the word she used. Misplaced. She said my daughter had called to talk about Easter, which we'd always done at my place, and somewhere in the conversation it had been suggested, not directly, just sort of floated out there, that maybe this year they'd do it at her in-laws' place in Oakville, and that maybe it would be a smaller, quieter thing, and that maybe, given how far Grandma had to travel, my mother lives 20 minutes from me in a seniors building on Barton Street. It might just be easier if she sat this one out. Sat this one out. My mother said it quietly, and then she said, I don't want to cause trouble, love. She said it the same way she'd said things my whole life when something had wounded her and she was already trying to protect everyone else from knowing it. I sat with it for a week. I told myself I was probably reading it wrong, that there must be a reason, that my daughter wasn't like that. I have a habit of giving people more benefit of the doubt than they've earned. My mother has told me this for years. Then I called my daughter. I asked her, straight out, what was happening with Easter. She got a little vague, a little breezy, said it was just logistics, just trying to simplify things. I asked her if her grandmother was invited. There was a pause, not a long one, just long enough. She said, Dad, it's a different kind of gathering. Their family is more. They have a certain way of doing things. It's not that Grandma isn't welcome. It's just that it might feel uncomfortable. For everyone. I said, for your grandmother or for your in-laws. Another pause. I just don't want it to be awkward, she said. I asked her if her grandmother had done something wrong. She said no. I asked if there was a specific problem. She said no. I said, "Then help me understand what the issue is." And she said, and I want to be careful how I write this because these are her words, not mine. She said that her mother-in-law had mentioned, after they'd visited me at Christmas, that she felt my mother was a little, and she searched for the word, a little rough around the edges. That she'd talked about her work, cleaning houses, at the dinner table, and it had made some people at the table uncomfortable. My mother had talked about her work. 31 years of getting up before the sun, taking the bus in January, coming home with cracked hands and sore knees, and this was the problem. That she'd mentioned it. I said, "Okay." That's all I said. "Okay." My daughter seemed relieved, like the conversation was over, like I'd understood and agreed. She moved on quickly to something else. I said goodbye. I told her I loved her. I hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I've had moments in my life where I had to decide who I was. Most of them didn't feel like decisions at the time. They just felt like the only thing I could do. When my wife left and I had to figure out how to be a father by myself, I didn't decide to step up. I just did it because there was no other option. When my mother needed a new fridge and I didn't have the money, I took extra shifts for 6 weeks. I didn't deliberate. I just did it. This felt like one of those moments. Not a decision, exactly. More like a recognition. I called my mother back. I said, "Ma, what are you doing Easter weekend?" She said she didn't know yet. I said, "You're coming here. I'm cooking. Just us." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "What about?" And I said, "Just us, Ma. You and me in the kitchen and the CBC radio on in the background like always." She laughed a little. She said that sounded just fine. I called my daughter the next day. I told her I'd be doing Easter at my place, that I hoped she and her husband might come by if they had time, but that I understood if they had other plans. I kept my voice level. I wasn't cold, but I wasn't warm in the usual way either. She picked up on it. She's always been perceptive, my daughter. She asked if I was upset. I said no. I said I just wanted to be honest with her about something. I said, "Your grandmother cleaned houses her whole life, so that I could stay in school an extra year when I needed to. She packed a lunch every day for 31 years, and she never once asked me to be embarrassed about it. I'm not going to start now. I love you, and I hope you have a beautiful Easter. But your grandmother will be with me." There was a long silence. She said, "Dad," I said, "I'll have food on it too. I hope to see you." I cooked for 2 days. My mother used to make a glazed ham for Easter that took the whole day. She'd start the night before with a brown sugar and mustard rub, let it sit overnight, then roast it low and slow while she made the sides. I learned it from watching her. I've been making it since I was in my late 20s, and I still can't get it exactly right. But I've gotten close. Close enough that every time I open the oven, I'm 12 years old again. And I'm standing on the linoleum in her kitchen on Barton Street watching her move around the stove with that particular efficient grace she had. I made the ham. I made scalloped potatoes. I made her coleslaw, the one with the apple in it. I made 2 kinds of pie, butter tart and rhubarb, from the stalks I'd frozen from my garden in August. I set the table with the dishes my grandmother had left my mother, the ones with the small blue flowers around the rim. Not fancy, just old, and to me they've always looked like exactly what they are. Something that lasted. My mother arrived at 12:30. I'd driven to pick her up. She walked in and looked at the table and pressed her hand to her chest like she does when something catches her off guard in a good way. She said, "You put out the good dishes." I said, "These are the only dishes I have, Ma." She laughed and I took her coat. We sat and we ate and we talked for 3 hours. She told me things I hadn't heard in years, stories about her own mother, about growing up in Cape Breton, about a landlord she'd had in her 20s who'd tried to overcharge her, and how she'd organized the other tenants on the floor, and they'd all refused to pay until he fixed the broken furnace. I had no idea. I said, "Ma, you were a union organizer." She said, "I was just cold." We listened to the radio. We did the dishes together. She fell asleep in the armchair in the living room for 20 while I made tea, which she would be mortified to know I noticed. At 3:45, there was a knock at the door. My daughter was standing on the porch. Her husband was behind her. She had a box of butter tarts from the bakery near their place. She'd remembered they were my mother's favorite. Her eyes were red around the edges. She didn't say much, just looked at me with an expression I recognized. I'd worn it myself a few times. The face you make when you've understood something a little late and you're not sure how to say so. I opened the door wider and said, "There's Ham." She came in. She went straight to her grandmother in the living room, and I heard my mother wake up and say her name, that particular voice she saves for the people she loves most, the voice that sounds like relief. Her husband shook my hand at the door. He said, "Thank you for having us." I said it was no trouble. I think he meant it. We sat back at the table. My daughter asked her grandmother about Cape Breton. My mother told the landlord's story again, a little differently this time, with a better ending. We all laughed. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I was washing up the blue flower dishes, and I thought about something my mother had said to me when I was about 15, when I'd come home, embarrassed after a friend had made some comment about what she did for work. I'd told her what happened, expecting her to be hurt. Instead, she'd looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "I clean up behind people who can't be bothered to clean up behind themselves. That tells you something about me, and it tells you something about them, and you should make sure you know which one is the compliment." I didn't entirely understand it then. I understand it now. My mother spent 31 years putting herself on a bus before the sun came up. She kept her word to every employer she ever had. She raised me. She helped me raise my daughter. She did all of it without asking for recognition or standing, without demanding anyone celebrate her for it, and without ever pretending she was something she wasn't. There is nothing rough about those edges. Those edges are the whole shape of her. My daughter called me a few days later. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She didn't give a big speech about it. That's not her style, and she gets that from me. She just said she was sorry and that she hadn't realized how much she'd started caring about the wrong things. She said her grandmother had called her the morning after Easter and they'd talked for almost an hour. She said her grandmother had been gracious, which is the only thing I can tell you that genuinely does not surprise me. I told my daughter I loved her. I told her I'd always love her, even when she drives me a little bit crazy. She said, "I get that from you," which is probably true. The house in Dundas still needs more work than it's worth. The porch railing has been on my list for 2 summers now. The kitchen faucet drips. I've got a garden that produces more zucchini than any 2 people can reasonably eat. None of it is impressive. None of it was ever meant to be. But last Easter, for the first time in longer than I could say, we sat at that old table with the blue flower dishes and we were, all of us, exactly where we were supposed to be. My mother's hands are still cracked at the knuckles. She takes the bus on Tuesdays to the market on James Street North because she says the prices are better there, and she doesn't need anyone driving her around like an invalid. She is 74 years old and she has more dignity in those cracked hands than anyone I have ever met in any house in any part of this city. I know exactly where I come from. I wouldn't trade it for a table full of fine china.